The following is brought to you by RealAg. Next thing you know the next thing. Next is Now is a short podcast discussing agriculture's emerging next-gen tech and trends as they're happening in our industry. Next is Now, presented by RealAg. Listen where you get your podcasts today.
A big thank you to our show sponsors, The Corn School, The Sharp Edge, and RealAg's newsletters. Don't miss out on any of the content we publish. Whether you're looking for agronomy, current events, or industry news, our daily newsletters will bring you our most current pieces every morning right to your inbox. Visit realagriculture.com/subscribe to get real and get connected. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lindsay Smith, and thankful to be back here in the host seat with my trusty producer, Jay, joining me as well. Tonight, we are going to save the N. That's right. We're going to save that nitrogen. But of course, before then, a few housekeeping items. If you collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow. Let us know you took in the show and we'll get those for you. As well, welcome to all our audience at RFD TV Canada. And what else do we need to cover? Oh, tonight, very exciting. For those of you with an off-calf project here in Ontario, tonight's episode does also qualify as a knowledge sharing event. So we'll have that email for you at the end of the program so you can make sure you get that. Okay. All right. So we did iron out most of our production issues from last week. Sounds like we maybe got one more to deal with, but thank you everyone for joining us here for our conversation. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us all the way from Nova Scotia, but of course not from Nova Scotia, is Bryce Geisel with Koch Agronomic Services. How are you, Bryce?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, so coming from Nova Scotia, but originated in Saskatchewan. So
that's right. Okay, and John Lauzon with the University of Guelph joining us as well. John, how are you? Oh, we're here. We'll try again. There we go.
Okay, I'm
there
here now.
All right. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, there's one too many buttons on my headset here, and it's good. But anyway, yes, I'm doing quite well, and hopefully everybody else is doing well tonight.
All right. Okay, so we are going to talk about saving nitrogen. This is, of course, a huge topic of conversation. Frankly, I think it's always been darn important, but yes, as you know, products have changed, as maybe some of the funding has changed for some of these products, more and more we're talking about how do we save that nitrogen, how do we make the most of every pound that's applied, and so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So I will open it up, of course, to the floor. Anyone who's got any comments or questions, head on over, get those into the comments, and we'll try and answer as many questions as we can. Now, let's start though. Bryce, tell us a bit about what you do with Koch Agronomic Services.
So yeah, absolutely. So Bryce Geisel, I'm the senior agronomist with Koch Agronomic Services. So it's a part of Koch Fertilizer Canada, and yeah, just kind of help with the agronomy standpoint, covering Canada from that, and working with the good team we have at Koch Agronomic Services, and just trying to make sure everyone's kind of understanding their fertilizer needs and what we can provide for them.
Now, and John, you do a lot of work. I'm going to ask you to summarize it on your area of expertise, if you can, in a nutshell. What is it that you work on at the University of Guelph?
It's mostly that nut part, but anyway, yeah, so my area is soil science, and more specifically soil fertility. So here at the university, I do a lot of teaching in the area of introductory soils, and then upper level courses in soil fertility and soil management. And I also do research in that same area. A lot of the research in the past is focused on nitrogen, but I have been splintering off into sulfur since that's become an issue here in Ontario, and I do work with all other nutrients as well.
All right. Okay. So if anyone has we do often talk sulfur and nitrogen in the same conversation. So it may come up. You never know. And okay, let's get into it then. We have to start with we can't save the nitrogen if we don't know how it's being lost. And so we're going to start with, of course, looking into all the ways in which we lose nitrogen. I have been accused at being somewhat dramatic about how many ways we can lose nitrogen. It is not 100 different ways. It's only a few. But Bryce, maybe we'll kick off with, I think you've got a really good slide that we can use to illustrate our point as we talk through this. But Bryce, when you sort of broach the subject, either with your agronomists or with your growers, and you're talking about all the ways we lose nitrogen, walk us through sort of the basics. When are we worried about losing it?
No, absolutely. Yeah. So there's really kind of the three main ways that we're focused on when we're thinking about losing nitrogen. And it really kind of falls along this whole nitrogen pathway. And obviously, it is a complicated pathway, as we all know. There's nitrogen coming and going from all sorts of places, whether it's mineralization or it's being applied via fertilizer. But when we really focus on that fertilizer, because that's what people are paying for, right, to put on their fields, they want to keep it there. So what do we have to be concerned about is kind of how do all the losses that kind of fall along from that pathway. So kind of the first one is that volatilization loss, so that ammonia loss that we see up through the atmosphere. That tends to be kind of the biggest concern that we have, one of the ones that we kind of tend to lose probably the most amount of nitrogen. We'll see that a lot of times, especially as we see that, in some of those drier environments of Western Canada, broadcasting nitrogen. Those can be a real big driver for volatilization. But as we kind of move that pathway, because of course that nitrogen's not staying static, right? It's moving from urea over to ammonia, to ammonium, and all the way over to nitrate. And then as we get along that pathway there, we can definitely be losing it in terms of nitrate leaching. So that's, obviously has been, big in the news in the past. We're losing nitrate down below the rooting zone into groundwater, etc., as definitely an area of concern. And then finally, the one that has been the most probably talked about in the last couple of years is denitrification as the loss there. So whether it's nitrous oxide, which is kind of the one that everyone's been talking about, as well as N2 gas as well. So those are kind of the three ones that we focus on.
All right, so Jay, let's leave this slide up while we go through a few of these. And if anyone's got any questions about this, but we are going to talk about sort of the situations in which some of these become more or less of a risk. John, remind us though, what can a plant take up? Of these forms of nitrogen, what forms do we need it to get to so that the plant can actually take it up?
So in the soil, there's two forms of N that the plant is primarily using, and that's ammonium N and nitrate N. Ammonium N, other than volatilization, is relatively stable. It's positively charged, and it can be held on the cation exchange complexes of the soil, resulting in leaching loss being relatively minimal. However, in the soil, as long as it's warm and moist, very quickly another process called nitrification is going to occur, which converts that ammonium into nitrate. Now, nitrate not only is negatively charged, yes, so it can't be held on the cation exchange complex, but it also has something else, and this takes a little bit of chemistry, but essentially all ions in solution have water around them. And nitrate has a lot of water around it. And so it can't come close enough to a positively charged element to form any sort of compound with it. And as such, it goes wherever water goes. The other part that we're going to see a little bit later is that nitrate, in cases where there's low oxygen, can be used in replacement of oxygen, essentially, in some organisms in the soil.
Okay, we are going to have to. I like this. No one has ever explained to me the water bubble. John, this is a. I'm picturing little nitrate molecules with these
We're
little
all living
bubbles.
in a bubble.
That's right. We are all bubbles. Okay. Okay. So this is important, of course, is that we need the nitrogen we apply, or nitrogen that is however it is in the soil, whether it's being mineralized, whatever the case may be. We need it to get to those forms that the plant can take up. We just need to protect it so that it's the plant that takes it up. And as both of you have outlined, we don't lose it either with that movement of water, which is leaching, or where we have or the identification, as you said. So this is the part where it gets very important that we choose, either through practices or through products, we choose the right things to minimize these losses. And that's what I want to talk about tonight, of course, is what practices and what conditions we can change or not change. And then of course we will talk products as well, because I do want to touch on, of course, we have single action enhanced efficiency fertilizers, and we have dual products. So I do want to talk about those too. Okay, so let's move into then, and John and Bryce, I'll sort of go to each of you. Bryce, maybe I'll go to you first. Thinking in the Western Canadian context, which of the loss pathways are we typically dealing with, or which are the two that we're most concerned about?
So it really kind of depends on the time of year and the application. So it kind of does have to go back to the 4 R's, right? We always have to swing back to the 4 R's. But the two that we're kind of most focused on in the prairies is volatilization. So potentially shallow banded, but broadcast at any time that urea is close to the surface. That's when volatilization is going to happen, and that's when we can see a big loss of that. The other one's the denitrification, and that kind of happens in the spring after snow melt. So that's kind of a big one, especially for anyone who's doing fall applications. And we know from an efficiency standpoint, just trying to get those acres across and the amount of product down. Fall application is definitely a growing application. And so when that nitrogen is sitting there, if it gets all the way to nitrate, by the time the freeze up happens, and then the spring we get that saturated soil from the snow melt. Usually, maybe not this year. We'll have to see how it works from this standpoint with the lack of snow. But normally we get those wet soils and we get that denitrification. That's when we see that big spike of that is usually in the spring snow melt.
Mm-hmm. Now, John, on the Ontario side, is perhaps somewhat of a different picture in that we aren't putting nitrogen on in the fall. I mean, we may be putting manure on or other things. Are we mostly worried about volatilization? But we also have tile drainage. Do we need to worry more about leaching in the Ontario context?
Yeah, if you look at the difference between the prairie provinces and Ontario and all of Eastern Canada for that matter, is the amount of precipitation we have and the amount of excess water. In the case of the prairies, they've got that little window in the spring where there's meltwater, plus the early part of the summer is a little bit rainier than the rest of the year. Ontario is different. Same amount of rainfall or precipitation pretty much every month of the year. What changes the amount that is extra is the amount of evapotranspiration potential. So spring and fall and winter tend to be our times where leaching and denitrification have the greatest possibility just because of that water budget. Now, in terms of what's most important, volatilization can happen really quick, and we can lose a lot of N here in Ontario or anywhere in Canada for that matter through volatilization within a week or so. And so that's still a major economic one. But if you're talking about which one is most important, that depends on your perspective. Denitrification quite often may not account for a huge volume of N, but the problem with it, one of the forms of N that can be lost is nitrous oxide, which probably a lot of you've heard through those targets that the federal government's trying to come up with, is a very potent greenhouse gas, about 300 times that of CO2. Yeah. And so it could be an important one in terms of environmental interest. Leaching as well, we used to hear about that more in terms of nitrate in groundwater, and we can get a heck of a lot of that here too, but we can minimize it by doing some of the things that we're going to be talking about later.
Okay. That's right. I like this foreshadowing, John. You're very good at it. So it is true though, and that is, one of the considerations and one of the discussions we've had on this show many times is, the volatilization loss as pounds of nitrogen may not necessarily be the most significant, but obviously from an environmental perspective, it is by far the most significant. So we do need to consider that, but it is going to depend on conditions, obviously. So that is super important as well. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit here. Let's talk about conditions. We've mentioned some of them here, but let's talk a little bit about conditions that are perhaps more conducive to loss. And Bryce, you've covered some of them with the denitrification. You did mention, though, of course, and for most of the prairie people, it has been dry. Has that made the nitrogen question and the nitrogen loss question an easier one to answer, or does it create its own set of concerns?
It definitely has its own set of concerns. Like that's going to be kind of a change in the years that we typically see. So again, for us in the prairies, volatilization is going to be the big concern, and that's kind of that anything that's broadcast, it's at the soil surface, whether it's broadcasting urea or putting on UAN through streamer nozzles or dribble bands. So keeping it close to the surface. If we don't get that moisture, that rainfall to help get that nitrogen down where it's into the soil safer, because we're not using tillage in the prairies, we're relying on moisture to try to push that nitrogen down to keep it safe. If it's sitting there on the surface or even shallow banding, I know that's kind of inconclusive in some research and stuff, but historically we have seen some shallow banding losses with volatilization, just because we're not putting that nitrogen very deep. So if we have those dry conditions and that nitrogen staying close to that surface or on the surface, that does put us at a real big risk of having some volatilization losses this year. So hopefully everyone will get those good rains this spring and we won't have to worry about that. But I think it is something we have to be considering going into spring.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That is always the hope, is that there will be water that we have to worry about such things. John, before I want to ask you a similar question, but Bryce, with the drier condition, I'm glitching really hard. I'm just going to keep talking and we're going to ignore the picture. With those drier conditions, though, are farmers? Are you seeing an increase in broadcasting because we don't want to be disturbing the soil as much because of the drying losses, or have you noticed any changes in approaches in that sense?
So yeah, we've definitely seen some changes. So we're seeing a swing in towards more broadcasting. I think there's probably the biggest driver is an efficiency standpoint, just the amount of product to go through and put that out onto fields. You can definitely float it on a lot faster than you can put it on through your air seeder. So that is something that is happening. There's still a lot obviously going on. The bulk is still getting put on shallow banded with air seeders, whether it's side banding or mid-row banding, whichever equipment piece you have, but definitely seeing that uptake both in the fall and the spring, just from that efficiency standpoint. So I think that is something to be concerned about. Obviously, from a spring broadcasting, that's where volatilization is going to be a concern going into this spring. Anything that was done last fall already, so we're kind of going in the past here. Hopefully, it was stabilized, and that's going to help reduce those volatilization losses. But if you just use the single inhibitor, you could be potentially at risk for some of those denitrification losses if we get some saturated soils kind of after the snow melt. We could still get some snow. We tend to see one big snowfall coming around Easter usually, so we'll see if we get that again or not. So
is that what we're waiting on? Please no. I don't want any more. John, your thoughts?
Well, I think if you bring up my slide 1, it might help to explain why some of the things that Bryce said are true. And so what we're looking at here are the factors that affect volatilization rate. And remember what we're talking about. Ammonia and ammonium are one hydrogen apart, if you like. Ammonium has a nitrogen with 4 hydrogens on it. Ammonia, the gas, only has 3. The distinction between the two is based on the pH of the system. As pH increases, becomes more basic, ammonium is converted to ammonia. But it's not until the pH reaches the high 7s that we have any ammonia that's present at all. As the pH increases above that, at about a pH of 9.2, there's equal quantities of both ammonium and ammonia, and above 9.2, mostly ammonia. And so it makes you wonder right off the bat, why do we have any volatilization at all? Because most of our soil pHs aren't anywhere near that range, and they aren't. The highest the pH of our soils here in southern Ontario, and the ones that are in the bulk of the prairies can be, is about 8.2, given the geology of the area. But most of them are lower than that. And so we don't tend to see a lot of ammonia loss on its own. That's where urea comes into the picture. When urea enters the environment, there is an enzyme that causes hydrolysis to occur. And that hydrolysis not only releases ammonium into the soil, but it also causes the pH to go up around that urea granule or around that liquid in 28%. That pH isn't going to be enough to change the bulk pH of the soil, but right around that granule, right where the ammonium's released, the pH goes up, and so ammonia can be formed under those conditions. Whether it's lost or not is dependent on some of the other factors that I'm going to look at in a second. The second one down the list is the buffer capacity of the soil. Soils have an ability to resist pH change, and that's largely dependent on the cation exchange capacity of the soil. So that negative charge, it can hold hydrogen, a positive charge, out of solution, and so it doesn't add to the pH. And so the greater the amount of organic matter in the soil and the greater the amount of clay, the greater the buffer capacity, or the less that pH is going to jump when that urea hydrolyzes. So on a really sandy, low pH or low organic matter soil, pH may jump quite a bit, at least in that localized area. Talked about it being a biological process, so temperature is going to be very important. As temperature increases, the rate of loss is going to increase as well. And so here in Southern Ontario, when we apply urea to the surface in winter wheat ground, for instance, it's cold and it's wet. That process happens over a long period of time and we don't see that much loss. But now you move a little bit further into spring around corn planting time where the soil's a little bit warmer and losses can be much greater. We heard something about moisture. That process needs water to happen. But if we've got some rain or very wet conditions, it will cause that granule to mix into a larger volume of soil. And as such, buffer the pH down more so it doesn't go up high enough that you would tend to get a lot of loss. And we hear Bryce talk about that mixing in the soil. That's what we're looking at there. If there's a rainfall after the urea goes on the ground, then it mixes it in and we tend to see less loss. One thing that's often overlooked is wind speed. And why that's important is that in the soil, yes, that ammonia forms, but for it to leave the soil and go up into the air, it does so by diffusion. The bigger the difference between the concentration in the soil and the air, the faster it leaves. And so if there's no wind, that ammonia just sits above the soil. No more concentration gradient, slower loss. But if we've got a high wind speed, then it whisks it away, high gradient, high loss as well. And that's what brought us to some of the things that we were just hearing about in terms of management. And one of the easiest things we can do here in Southern Ontario on corn ground is to put that urea below the soil surface. And by below the soil surface, it doesn't have to be that deep. But what I want to see is that it's perfectly covered. Now, why that's important? Even below the ground, that urea will hydrolyze. The pH will go up. And when it does, ammonia will form. But before that ammonia can reach the soil surface, it's going to work its way through low pH soil. It's converted back into ammonium, and loss is essentially zero. But the key there is that it has to be completely covered. If there's any pathways going down to that granule, it will leave rather rapidly. And I think that's one thing that we also need to understand is that when this loss happens, it doesn't happen over the entire year. It happens right after you apply that urea. Within the first week is when most of the loss occurs. It may linger for another week after that, but 90% of the loss is going to be in a very short time period. And if conditions are perfect for loss, you could lose almost all of it in a really short time period. And so the point I'm trying to get at is that when we look at these factors impacting it, we've got to understand what's affecting the loss to give us an idea of how quickly and what type of management we have to do in order to minimize it. If there's very little chance of loss, then we might be able to lag a little bit and it's no big deal. But if the conditions are right, we better get at it really quick or we could lose a lot really quick.
Okay, let's leave it there for just a moment because that I think works really well into Bryce. I want to give you a chance to sort of walk us through exactly that. It's a great point, John, that the window of loss that we really need to think about, and that's where choosing the right product might come in as well, or that right management practice. Now, we are just going to quickly, I just want to quickly address everyone in the comments. Thank you all for persevering. We do seem to have a bit of an issue between our live link and it actually connecting to the YouTube live stream. So thank you all who have made your way here. I know it wasn't maybe the easiest. We will address that. We'll get that fixed for next week. But thank you all for making your way here through YouTube if you had to. We've got some great questions coming in as well. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to quickly go to our first clip. This is from The Sharp Edge, and this is Mike Miller. And this is a conversation on that conversation of splitting N, yes, but thinking about our rainfall and our moisture situation in that and making some of those choices on the management side. Here's our clip.
This idea of laying down 28 as a band at the bottom of the corn row, it's had lots of interest. I'm not sure whether the interest is quite as high today as it was, 6 years ago. What are you feeling about this this sort of late nitrogen application?
Well, I'm actually pretty excited about it now. This is, I guess this is our third year of doing it, and we've had actually kind of a wide range of weather the last few years. 2020 was really dry for us up until about the 15th of July.
Yeah.
And it was actually, the first year was a pretty big learning experience, but we actually did start pulling nitrogen rates back pretty heavily in 2020, and that was kind of a bonus for being able to put it on late.
Right.
I'd say that's probably the biggest advantage for us, to be able to really wait and kind of
be a little bit smarter with your rate selection if you can do it at the end of June, 1st of July, as opposed to thinking you know what it is on the 1st of June.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well, you're kind of guessing at the 1st of June,
a little
right?
bit, yeah. So the other apprehension about laying 28 on the soil surface is volatilization. Your loss of N from urea. Are you protecting? Are you stabilizing? What's your procedure on trying to stop the volatilization from those surface bands?
Yeah, so we're running a stabilizer for volatilization and leaching. So. Right. I think that's an important aspect of this whole system, is to be able to stabilize your N. So
cool.
Yeah, so last year, I guess the tap turned on right about this time of year, like the end of June. We got a 4-inch rain overnight, and then that followed the next 10 days with about another 6 or 8 inches of rain. It was just unbelievable how much rain we got that time frame last year. I know we had a couple conversations about that, and I did start pushing nitrogen rates quite a bit higher than I normally would, to the 230, 240 range. And I did a fair bit of testing up to about 270 pounds applied. And I wish I had gone above 300, because it was still showing response at that rate.
Right. So there's
something to it.
Yeah. So rainfall is a component that you're going to try to work with in terms of your N rate selection in this late side dress deal.
Our sponsors for the Agronomists are RealAg newsletters, the Corn School, and the Sharp Edge. The Sharp Edge is a video series where we look to farmers, agronomists, and researchers to give us the sharp edge on everything from agronomic problem solving to increasing profitability and improving sustainability. The Sharp Edge is made possible by support from Maizex Seeds. All right, welcome back, everyone, to the Agronomist. Great to see everybody sticking with us through the broadcast. Okay, so we've got some good questions that have come in. A lot of them have to do with depth and coverage. So we'll get to those in a minute. But Bryce, let's back up just a step to what John walked us through as far as that volatilization risk. Now, so moisture is going to play a factor, depth. The closure of any sort of slot that we're doing is definitely going to play a role as well. I'd never thought about wind, John. That really, I just have like these visions of like the anhydrous ammonia smoke going off. But anyway, okay, it's not smoke, everybody. Anyway, my prairie is showing. Okay, so Bryce, in that situation though, when we're talking about protecting against volatilization losses, what are our options as far as products? We can talk a bit about management, and we will in a minute more of depth, but what products do we have and how do they work?
So really kind of there's a couple of products you can look at to help with reduced volatilization. So kind of the first one is the urease inhibitor. So as John mentioned, it was the urease enzyme. So it's pretty straightforward. Urease inhibitor inhibits that urease enzyme. So not a lot of complicated math that we got to go in terms of what pathway it's working on. And so that's what we want to focus on for that, because that's going to kind of delay that process. So it's going to reduce the amount of urease enzyme because it's blocking it, and that'll stop, kind of delay it from going from urea over to that ammonia. Of course, it doesn't do it for long. It will degrade in the soil. So just buying yourself a little bit of time. So that way, hopefully you can get it incorporated, or you'll get that rainfall. It'll allow it to melt and move into the soil, like all those different things that were kind of covered to really kind of get through the time there. And whether that's a single inhibitor, that's a straight urease inhibitor, or a dual inhibitor, which also will contain a urease inhibitor, will kind of, that's the pathway that we're going to focus on. Obviously, the other one too would be polymer coateds. That can be utilized as well. That's just kind of that by having that physical barrier and keeping it kind of stuck as urea again till later on type ideas. So that way it's going to help reduce those volatilization. So it's kind of choosing the product that's going to fit for what you're needing to use in your operations.
So now there's a question here that Michael asks: if we ban nitrogen in the soil at a shallower depth and close and pack that trench, do we minimize N loss versus putting it down deeper without the closure and packing? John, so thinking through that scenario, which one are we worried about? Is it more important to make sure it's closed if it's shallow, or if it's deeper, does that sort of diffusion up save us a little bit?
If I had to pick between one of the two, I would go shallower with a better closure.
Okay.
If you've got a deep band and you've got a clear line of view down to where your urea is placed, you will have loss. You won't have changed that system that much from simply throwing it right on the ground. And so having it covered up, and that's key in that, covering it and covering it well, because most of the time people just scuff a little bit on top. Well, there's still big pathways going down to where that urea is. I mean, covering it well so that there's no big channels running directly down to the granule. If you do, whenever we measure it and we've got good coverage, our loss is zero.
Okay. All right. So shallow and well covered is better than deeper but open. Okay. Got it. Now, the question of the dual inhibitor, and this is a good one, Peter. Even though Peter is slagging me for being 2 minutes late, I will still take his question. Peter Johnson says, okay, so Mike, so in that clip, so Mike is saying he used a dual inhibitor on corn in July. Are we concerned, John, I'll go to you on this one, about nitrogen availability? And Bryce, I'll ask you this as well, just even generally speaking, this question does come up. I know with the polymer coated, at times we get that question. John, are we worried in something like, that immediacy of that high need part in June, July? Are we worried about N not being available if we're going to use dual inhibitors?
Okay, let's start and take a little bit of a step back and decide whether that's going to benefit us at all in terms of having the dual inhibitor at that time of the year. Just because we have nitrate in the soil doesn't mean it's going to be lost. The only time we're going to have loss is if there's a driving force. And that means having enough water that it can move it down to depth. If there's no water to move it to depth, it's not going anywhere. At that time of the year here in Southern Ontario, it's very rare that we would have enough water to cause it to move to depth. Yes, we get the odd time where we get a huge rainstorm, but it takes more water than what a lot of people would think. The soil acts as a big sponge at that time of year. It can soak up quite a bit, preventing it from being lost. And so whether or not you need it at all is a question. And then Peter's more thinking of, is it going to delay it so long that it's not going to benefit the crop? And to understand that, you've got to understand the pattern of nitrogen uptake in an annual crop like corn. You put that seed in the ground in May, and it's growing really slowly because it doesn't have a lot of leaf area. It can't grow. It can't capture that much sunlight to grow very quickly. And so in between there and maybe almost to side dress time, it's taken up very little nitrogen. But soon after side dress time, it starts to close in the canopy, meaning it's intercepting as much light as it possibly can, grows like crazy, takes up nitrogen like crazy. And so at that later time of the year, I'd be a bit nervous about delaying it any longer than it needed to be. When they're talking about putting it on at the stage that we've seen in that video, that's well into that rapid growth phase. In fact, a little bit later on. Now, I'm presuming that they're also putting a good chunk of their N on pre-plant and then coming in later and just topping it up. But regardless, I don't think there's going to be a huge benefit to the nitrification inhibitor at that time of the year. And there's the potential that we could have a detriment if it delays it so long that the plant can't get at it. Because the other thing that's happening at that time of the year, when you put it on the surface, our soils are sometimes so dry that it's positionally unavailable, meaning the soil is so dry that the roots in that zone aren't physically feeding. And so we want to make sure that it gets in there probably as quickly as we can at that time of the year.
If you could order a rain right after, then we solve so many problems, John. Like just
I would order one about once a week and a little bit over an inch, and that would make me happy.
There we go. Okay. Now, but Bryce, we face this a similar question, but different time of year, and a different challenge though. Certainly, when we look at using some of these products for spring applied in Canada, that hold back this crop potentially if that polymer coating doesn't break down.
Sorry, Lindsay, you kind of cut out on me there, so I'm not sure it was mine or yours, but I think you were just kind of asking about the same question in Western Canada. Is that? Yeah. Okay. So obviously, it is one of the things we have to consider. So in Western Canada, we're typically not quite dealing with as long of kind of a lag as they'll see in Ontario with corn. Kind of for that rapid uptake, we tend to see it, a little bit earlier. Think of canola, especially, but even wheat as well, or any of the cereals. So it is something to think about. But really, in those spring applications, it's going to be that volatilization that's going to be really what you need to focus on. You don't necessarily need the nitrification inhibitor from that standpoint. Where we really kind of want to start to see those nitrification inhibitors being utilized is that fall application, because we're seeing that grow every year in Western Canada. Again, efficiency, timing, potentially fertilizer costs. There's many factors that go into why people want to do that. And it is always funny when you get to talk to people from other places, because that just is a very foreign concept to a lot of places outside of Western Canada, where our soils get nice and frozen for a very big chunk of the of the year. Nothing's happening, so we can kind of get away with that and a lot more. But if we're kind of putting that on, if we can kind of keep more of that as ammonium in the soil rather than nitrate going into that freeze up, that's going to be a lot better situation for us going into spring, because we won't have as much nitrate, because it's going to be that free nitrate in the spring as we kind of get that melt and everything. And then also that lag period before we get in seeding, putting the crop in the ground, then it's got to germinate, cold soils, it can be some delays and get going. There's a big window there that we can have some of the losses there, that if we can kind of keep that from happening as long as possible, that's where we're going to see kind of the success from it. So that's kind of where I kind of look at it, is we want to see those nitrifications from that application in the fall, because again, that whole process of nitrification is a bacteria. So everyone kind of has their kind of number of when those bacteria stop doing anything in the soil. Ask a different agronomist, will probably give you a different answer, but they're all in that same kind of ballpark of 8 to 10 degrees. Anything below that, they're just shut down. So once that soil is cold, anything that's still ammonium will pretty much stay ammonium in Western Canada. But come springtime, especially if you're putting that nitrogen on right at the time of seeding, that is really the time that we'll want to just kind of focus on, make sure we don't lose it through ammonia volatilization.
So, and let's hope my connection holds for this question, Bryce. We do have, we have single action products and we have dual. I think in agriculture, sometimes we tend to err on the, if one mode of action is good, two is better, when we think of herbicides or, that sort of stuff. Is that true for nitrogen, or do we really just need to match our loss risk with the product and not, we don't necessarily always need dual, do we?
No, we don't always need duals. It's nice having all these different products because they all have a different fit depending on how you're putting your nitrogen down. Someone's going to be broadcasting in the spring. Someone might be doing a fall broadcast or doing anhydrous in the fall. Someone's going to be putting it down in a mid-row band. So there's lots of different ways that nitrogen get put. We see a little bit of top dressing that happens in Western Canada as well. So there are kind of those different ways. So it is good having some choices. And that's really kind of, what I want people to think about is what is going to be the best product for them to use in their operation. Having those conversations with an agronomist, with your retail, and having, okay, this is what my plan is. How much nitrogen up front? When am I putting it on? Which crop is it? Because definitely, canola needs that nitrogen earlier than a lot of the other crops out there. So it does play into that factor. So it is one of those ones where, dual mode of action does sound good. Sounds like you're getting a lot of protection, and you can be getting a lot of protection, but it might not be the best choice. So choosing the one that is going to be what's going to provide you the best benefit is going to be a much better route to success.
John, from the soil scientist perspective, do we consider, the 4 R's when we think about right place or right rate or right timing? Are those a mode of action? And we can think about it that way, that we're adding a mode of action in that sense and saving our N?
Oh, exactly. We're just looking at another tool in the toolbox. And so, in a lot of ways, if you're managing nitrogen already really, really well, and there's no freak environmental condition that happens, then probably you don't need any of these products. But it's when we've got uncertainty that we've got some of these issues come into play. And I'll give you an example. Here in Southern Ontario, on average, by the time May comes around, we don't get a lot of excess water that's going to depth. But some years we do. And depending on how often that happens will dictate whether or not you need to slow that conversion of ammonium down to nitrate in the spring. And so knowing your environment and knowing how often it's a problem will give you some idea of the risk that you're at and the chance that you are of seeing a benefit from doing those practices.
Okay, so I'm actually a little disappointed, everyone. No one has asked the question, does using an enhanced efficiency fertilizer get me more yield or allow me to pull back my nitrogen rate? No one has asked. And that means no one gets a hat, except for my guests. They can get hats. That's it. But we're not giving away hats. Okay, so, but I've had that question before. And certainly in, many times that comes up, that if I'm minimizing loss, doesn't mean I can pull back. So John, I'll start with you first. Is that the case? How do I make that consideration of, all right, I'm protecting against loss, do I pull back that rate? What's your comfort level there?
Okay, maybe if you could bring up my slide 4, there's a graph there that shows a yield response. And I think it starts to illustrate what's going on here. Those products do nothing to increase the yield potential of that corn variety or whatever it is that's growing. It doesn't change the yield potential at all. But if you start thinking about what a typical yield response to applied nitrogen fertilizer looks like, where we need nitrogen, of course, is we've got a curve similar to what we're seeing here, where the yield goes up drastically when we put on the first little bit of nitrogen because it's hugely limiting. But then as we put more and more on, other things become the limiting factor, whether it be incoming solar radiation or whether it be water, whatever the case may be, and yield levels off. And in fact, if we kept putting on more nitrogen, our yield would come down because it becomes toxic to the plant. But what's more important for me is where the grower is going to make the most money. The highest yield isn't the spot that's going to make you the most money. You want the greatest return. And I've indicated an X where that typically would occur. Somewhere a little bit less than the maximum yield is where your wallet's going to be the fattest and not necessarily your bin the fullest. So if we go now to my last slide, we'll see what happens when we add these products, if they do something. And it's going to be something that's very similar to what we would see in Southern Ontario for a side dress application. Side dress application, we put on less nitrogen because we lose less on average. And because we lose less, more of it ends up in our crop. and we can get a slightly higher yield at lower N rates. Now, if you look at where my X started to be, the yield is actually a little bit higher in this case with that product that reduced the loss. But is that the best place on the curve that we should be? Yes, the yield may be a little bit greater, but we could make a heck of a lot more money by repositioning ourselves along the response curve to the new position that gives us the greatest return given the new cost profile and the new yield response that we get. So yes, indeed, yield may go up a little bit, but that's probably not making you the most money. The combination of the yield going up and repositioning to where that new most economic rate of application is going to make us the greatest amount. Now, in certain years, you might find that the yield goes up a lot with these products. And what's gone on? Well, you've got a particularly responsive site. And those old responses that were based on normal urea weren't high enough rates in order to meet the demand. So by losing less, you've got essentially a higher rate and yield goes up a little bit. But on average, what we should see is something very similar to what we see for side dress application, where the N rate is slightly lower because more of the end ends up into the crop as opposed to ending up somewhere else. And in fact, if we don't reduce the rate of N, then there's a good chance that although we might have saved that N early in the spring, there's going to be more of it hanging around in the fall. The plant can only take up so much. And that extra is likely to be hanging around in the fall, and we could have some leaching and denitrification happen there. So it's a combination. You use these products, yeah, the yield might go up a little bit, but I think the greatest benefit to the grower is by repositioning. Now, what that change in nitrogen should be, me and my colleagues need to get on that and try to figure out what that level is. But it's going to be something similar, probably at best, to what we see for side dress, maybe a little bit more in some cases where volatilization in the past has been a big issue. The change might be even bigger than that. So, yes, could go up, but the biggest thing is to reduce the N rate.
So there's a lot to unpack here, and we're going to. So, Producer Jay, if you will, just leave this slide up, and because I want Bryce to weigh in on this, and we've got some comments that have come in. And Derek mentions, and I think this is very key. It really does depend on if N is the limiting factor, and so exactly that. And John, you addressed that's why we tend to see that the curve go steeply up at first and then start to level off, and that's accounting for N being very limiting. Now, there's a few other things in here, and that's about if the loss actually was going to occur or does occur. And Bryce, that's where I want to bring you in on this conversation as well, is that these are risk management tools. And so the question of, if I use this, can I cut my N rate? How do you broach that topic in the case that, if the conditions aren't right for loss, then the N isn't going anywhere necessarily. So how do you balance sort of the risk and the reward and that question of, can I reduce my N rate?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's always a hard question to answer because I think there's so much things that go into producing a high yielding, economic crop that it's a very challenging thing, as everyone on this call and watching knows. So it's really trying to understand where those things are, and exactly as kind of some of the comments in about, can we cut it back? In some cases, you're going to be able to. In some cases, you're not, because those losses were kind of holding your yield back. And when you kind of use these products, use enhanced efficiency fertilizer, you'll see a yield response. So it kind of answers that question, that all of a sudden, okay, the nitrogen was a limiting factor. It was a high yield or a high loss year. So that way we see the benefit with it. We don't know if that's going to happen. So it's kind of like any of these preventative type practices, same as, typically using a fungicide, or then there's lots of practices we use in agriculture that we have to go ahead of time based on conditions, based on what we know, historics, and everything that goes with it. We know that there's going to be some rains, and we know there's going to be periods of dry. So typically, if it's been been dry, maybe, coming into a situation where it's been dry, we're not going to get the moisture, we're probably setting ourselves up for a higher volatilization losses potential. Could always be wrong. You could always get the rain. And even what we've seen, the rains have been pretty, sporadic, and where, one field on a farm gets, a nice half inch, the other one gets a tenth, and the other one gets 2 inches. So you just never know what you're going to get. So by kind of planning into this, that's going to be the big thing, is you're setting yourself up that, okay, this is my target yield. This is the nitrogen I think I'm going to need. I'm accounting for, residual nitrogen. I'm counting for, with a spring soil test, I'm accounting for maybe a bit of mineralization depending on my soil. And if I see that kind of thing, and I want to target this much nitrogen fertilizer, I want to be pretty close to that. I don't want to lose it. I want to use an enhanced efficiency product because that's my target, and that's where I'm going to kind of hit. There's going to be situations where, maybe that people have been over applying because they're getting losses, and they've seen that response, and you can actually dial it back a little bit because they've had a little bit of, they've accommodated for those losses by putting more nitrogen down.
Yeah.
And then, so therefore, you can maybe pull it back a bit. So usually, if anyone's interested in kind of pulling it back, I always recommend, like, don't go all into it. Do a bit of test on your farm with your practices, because it's going to be different. And maybe you can kind of go in and put a couple of strips in, or part of a field, and pick a number that's going to be easy. Maybe it's 15%, 20%, whatever you're kind of comfortable with. Everyone has a risk. Some people are going to say, no, I'm going in, I'm going to go 30%. Others are like, yeah, I might only do 10%. Yeah. So everyone's going to have a comfort level. Try that out, see what it is, and then you can kind of start making those tweaks over time. This isn't going to be something when you're getting into these products for the first time that you're just going to be able to say, yeah, I'm going to be able to dial this in first year and be successful. It's going to take a little trial and error to figure out what is going to work best on, in your farm for your applications, whether it's a single or a dual inhibitor. And then same thing as, can I pull it back, or do I need to keep what I've been doing and potentially, kind of go that way? So, well, not a very vague answer, but I think it's something that's an individual tailored, recipe that everyone kind of has to have for their own farm, based on kind of their practices and their risk tolerance as well.
Mm-hmm. But I think that for a few things, I mean, it does, though, and you've outlined a couple different scenarios that are very real scenarios. If farmers have been, they know they're having some loss, so they've been over applying. This could mean that they don't need to do that, in which case they are going to save that. So that's a win. And also we have to think about, are you in a situation where certain losses are likely? And if the situation is not that those losses are likely, then you may be just as well to not use a product and just go with your fine-tune rate. So there are many scenarios, which I think it's really important to be able to go through, which is part of the reason for this conversation. Now, there's a few key points that I want to come back to on that, but I'm just going to pause for a moment. Producer Jay, if you would, if we've got the slide, just a reminder that for watching tonight's program, to qualify for that knowledge sharing event with your off-CAF funding, potentially, if you've got a project with Ontario Soil and Crop, you can send Margaret an email. Let her know that you took in the show, and she will make sure that she gets all your details, your project number, all those sorts of good things. So that's mmay@ontariosoilcrop.org. Yes, Peter Johnson, you're right. Nitrogen is very complex. And then we put nitrogen in a soil system and we have plants. So yes, it gets very complicated. Okay, so while we leave that up on the screen, there is something we need to clarify. And John and Bryce both, this is why I love to have a Westerner and an Easterner on the show, because we have very different, and Bryce, you sort of walked us through, very in the West, if you take a fall soil test, there's a reason we account for N in a fall soil test, and we use that to do our planning, because that soil freezes solid. It often gets very cold very early, and not a lot of biological activity happens past that point. And so, John, you talked about where, if we're protecting that N and maybe it sticks around, that we may be open to losing that N later in the season. But in the West, maybe not. And certainly in dry years, there's been a lot of residual N that has hung around in that soil that the next crop uses. So, John, I'll go to you first on just to recap that idea that nitrogen that doesn't get taken up by the crop in that field, what happens to it in the growing season in an Ontario scenario?
Okay, in Southern Ontario, again, it comes back to understanding the climate that we live in. Again, our precipitation is about the same every month of the year. We get about 80 millimeters, 90 millimeters every single month of the year. But what changes is evapotranspiration. In the summer, when it's warm and sunny, evapotranspiration actually goes way up beyond the rainfall rate. And so our soil is drying out, and everybody sees this from May to about mid-June, depending on the texture of your soil. No big problems because the soil is acting as a bank account of water to allow those plants to survive okay. But after that bank account runs out, soil starts to dry out, and our corn leaves start to curl up or our grass turns brown. But in the fall, yes, the precipitation rate stays the same, but the evaporation rate drops. And so now we've got more precipitation than evaporation. Our soil starts to rehydrate. And at some point in the fall, for sandy soils earlier than for some of the other soils, that ability to hold the water against gravity fills up, and all the extra water has to go somewhere, either goes to leaching or runoff. Now, in the case of sandy soils, you're going to have predominantly leaching because the rate at which water infiltrates is really quick. And so even on a really heavy rainfall, it's all going down. And when it does, any nitrate that's there is going with it. In a clay soil, different scenario. Now we've got water that moves down through the soil relatively slowly. And so in a heavy rainfall, a lot more of it's going to run off across the top, and we lose some of our N in runoff, another loss that we could talk about here as well. But what
Mhm.
also happens is that clay soil stays wet longer. And in that wet soil, oxygen becomes limited. In oxygen limited soils, there are some forms of soil life that can do something we can't. We use oxygen as an electron acceptor, and then we send it off as CO2. When oxygen becomes limited in the soil, they can use nitrate as an electron acceptor, same way we use oxygen. But in doing so, they give it off as a gas. So in those clay soils, we'll tend to have longer wet periods, and so denitrification can occur. And so long story short, you can't win for losing in southern Ontario. You're going to lose it either by leaching or denitrification through that fall and into the spring time period. And so you cannot count on that end still being around in any great quantities. It also means that you can't use a fall soil test because it's really meaningless for Ontario
That's
conditions.
right.
And in fact, the end test has to be taken within a very short period of time of
Yeah.
of actually applying the end, because even in the spring, that end level is changing on a day by day basis, almost exponentially from one day to the next. And
Okay,
so it's messy.
so exactly. Very messy, but that is because of mineralization. So Bill had a question about soil mineralization. We need water to drive that mineralization. We need temperature to drive that mineralization. So as that soil warms up and we've got that moisture, that's what happens. It's why we take those in-crop nitrate tests, especially for corn. Now, Bryce, we're going to have to explain to Peter Johnson that when soil is frozen solid, it doesn't count as between application and plant uptake. So he's saying, and Peter, I'm going to use your term, you need to give your head a shake. He's saying, how dare we have 7 months between application and plant uptake? But I challenge that actually it's more like 3, which if people are putting nitrogen on in March, when does the wheat crop need it? It's not that it's a long time. And so if our soils are frozen solid, Peter, we can't count those months. So it's not necessarily 7 months. Anyway, Bryce, similar question to John. We do take soil tests in the fall, Peter, because they can be accurate as heck, because that nitrogen, for the most part, sticks around. So, Bryce, can we count on potentially that end sticking around if it's not used in one growing season?
So generally, as a kind of rule of thumb, we can. You might get a little bit of loss, you might get a little bit of gain, depending, the fall. Like there's a lot of factors that go into it, but it's usually good enough to kind of give us a starting point. Is it going to be exact? No, it's not going to be exact because we are going to have some loss, we're going to have some gain, there's going to be some movement. And then, we were talking about complexity. Let's talk about the different crops, and they'll have the different carbon to nitrogen ratios, which residue we're talking about. So some years, we'll have more mineralization because it was a pulse crop or or a soybean crop versus, a cereal crop, or it might get less the year after. So there's a lot of other factors that go into that piece. But no, absolutely, we kind of can count on a lot of it going into the spring. So exactly, if it is frozen, it's going to stay there. The watch out, I will put this caveat though, is making sure that we're not putting that nitrogen on too late in the fall, that soil is already frozen. Because if that soil is frozen, then that nitrogen cannot go down, and it's going to stay up there, and then we're going to be at a risk of runoff. And that's exactly, we didn't touch on runoff today. That's probably a whole nother conversation just around that. But assuming everyone's kind of put it on, at a good timing when soils are cooling, but they're not frozen. So maybe, they're kind of dropping into, 12, 10 degrees and dropping type idea. Then we can really and we're stabilizing it. So we know we're not going to get the volatilization losses. We can kind of count on that, once it starts to thaw in the spring and get going, that if that nitrogen will be there for the most part. We can pretty much count on it most years. Every once a year we get thrown a curveball, but that's farming for us. So
yeah, absolutely. Now, and I will also, to the defense of Western farmers, we have a lot of ground to cover, Pete. Ontario has a couple million acres. The Western Canada has over 20 million acres just of canola. That's a lot of ground to get product on if we're going to do it all in the spring. And our wheat and canola crops are hungry pretty early. So there you go. I am Team Prairie on this one. But I think it very much speaks to the importance of understanding, as John has pointed out, your conditions and the rainfall patterns and what is normal for your region and where you are and what those risks will be. So I think, yes, Peter is telling me I'm trying to dig myself out of a hole. No, I'm right. And so there you go. And it's my show, so I can say that. Okay, we are out of time. This has been absolutely fantastic. Wonderful questions from the audience as well. So great to see so many people on, and just a fascinating discussion. I learned about little water bubbles around nitrogen, and I will never forget that, John. Thank you for that. So John, thank you so much for joining me here on the Agronomists.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, and Bryce, it is late there in Nova Scotia, so I do appreciate you staying up late to join our show.
no problem. I'm still running on Mountain Time, especially being from
Yeah.
Saskatchewan. We don't do a time change, so we just run the same time all the time. So
you are the smartest province. It's true. I'll give Saskatchewan that one. Next week, of course, we're back 8 p.m. Eastern. We're going to maybe we'll talk a bit about runoff losses next week. We're going to talk about phosphorus, and that is a big one that we do need to worry about with runoff losses as well. And Ray, I would agree we could do another whole hour on this discussion, but that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you, everyone. And send Margaret that email if you need that KSE. And thank you all. We'll see you next week here on the Agronomists. Cheers, everybody.
okay.